Okay, good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for what I know will be a riveting, educational, and thought-provoking discussion on the ethical dilemmas Hippocratic oath-abiding physicians face today in the 21st century, reflecting on the lessons learned from the prior century. My name is Diana Blum, and I'm a board-certified neurologist, the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, a refugee from the former Soviet Union, and a proud founding fellow of Fair in Medicine. I originally joined the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism as a concerned mother who began noticing a rise in anti-Semitism within my own community. I felt compelled to do something about it and instantly found that I was not alone. FAIR will be celebrating its 1-year anniversary tomorrow, and in just 12 months, we have established 115 chapters representing all 50 states and Canada with 40,000 members. The Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing civil rights and liberties for all Americans, promoting a common culture based on fairness, understanding, and our shared humanity. I concentrated my efforts on fair in medicine because physician silencing has become an unfortunate accepted reality. And as we will learn tonight, that is never good for the human race. Diversity of thought is becoming obsolete as many physician colleagues no longer feel safe participating in open and honest debate. I am watching as my fellow healers succumb to groupthink with no regard to the negative unintended consequences for our patients. I am seeing a devaluation of scientific method principles leading to faulty conclusions and policy prescriptions that have no regard for the needs of human beings. And all of this has culminated in the destruction of trust in the once sacred doctor-patient relationship. As you will learn tonight, the Holocaust did not begin with Mengele or Auschwitz, but rather with people who genuinely believed they were doing something for the greater good. Time is often the best judge of who is on the right or wrong side of history, but it is critical for us to reflect and learn from mistakes of the past so that we minimize suffering in the future. I'm going to share a personal story, which I hope puts in perspective the nuance that is necessary to recognize when dealing with ethical issues in medicine. My 100-year-old grandpa, a Holocaust survivor, passed away 3 weeks ago after having a stroke. As a neurologist, I felt comfortable helping my mom make medical decisions about his care. But what I wasn't prepared for was how his personal values and needs were very quickly dismissed, replaced by hospital protocols, making his last wishes irrelevant. The hospital had rules, and even though my grandpa was COVID negative, 100% blind, and spoke no English, his only daughter, my mom, a nurse, fully vaccinated and boosted, was not allowed to see him. I was told that only the nursing supervisor can authorize visitation rights, and she was just following orders when she decided to deny my grandpa his dignity. When it was clear my grandpa would be placed on comfort care, they allowed adult family members to come say goodbye, but would not let my children, his great-grandchildren, ages 12 and 16, come pay their final respects because the policy stated no minors. After much pleading, there was rumors of a possible exception for the 16-year-old, but not the 12-year-old. And so we wasted precious time arguing with administration instead of processing our grief and paying final respects. It was only after I threatened a major PR nightmare that an exception was finally granted for my kids to say their last goodbyes. Reflecting on the last 72 hours of my grandpa's life motivated me to come here and speak with you today. I hope our discussion will inspire others to find their moral courage to speak up. It is truly an honor to welcome Dr. Matthew Wynia, professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and Colorado School of Public Health, and director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado. He is an elected fellow of the Hastings Center, past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and past chair of the Ethics Forum of the American Public Health Association. Dr. Wynia has led projects related to ethics and professionalism in healthcare with the National Academies, the Joint Commission, professional associations, and multiple government agencies on topics including public health and disaster ethics, understanding and measuring ethical climate of healthcare organizations and systems, ethics and quality improvement, engaging patients as members of the medical team, medicine and the Holocaust, and inequities in healthcare. He has delivered dozens of named lectures and visiting professorships nationally and internationally, and has authored more than 170 published articles. Dr. Wynia's talk today, Health Professionals in the Nazi Era, Learn from the Past, Understand the Present, Protect the Future, is of critical importance for all healthcare professionals who have the privilege of caring for human life. After his lecture, we will have time for questions and answers, so please put those in the Q&A section and we will get to as many as we can. Without any further delay, Dr. Wynia.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was that was an introduction that makes me think I have to trim down my introduction, but I really appreciate it. And your story, of course, is very powerful and a reminder of the humanity that really should be at the core of the work that we do every day. I'm gonna give a talk today that I have given this talk a number of times. It is a very difficult talk. It was developed a number of years ago and sort of evolves every time I give it and learn more from the historians that I've spent a lot of time with around this. But I want to give special appreciation to Dr. Patricia Haber-Rice. She is now the senior historian at the Mandel Center at the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum. And she and I have worked together on this history for about 17 years now. And so I'm gonna just sort of dive in here. Dr. Rice likes to say when she gives her version of this talk that this is a story about medicine, but specifically it's a story about medicine mishandled as state policy under a notorious dictatorship. And I agree with her, this is a story like that, but it's also, I think, a story, a broader story about what does it mean to be a health professional then, now, and into the future, because it's the story in large part of how we came to be where we are today, how we have the ethics that we have today. And I think this story, as dark as it is, can provide illumination for the path ahead if we can learn to use it. This is our story. It is an understudied aspect of Holocaust history. Not many people specialize in this area. And it's an oversimplified aspect of Holocaust history. And I think there are some reasons for that, starting with the fact that it is very comforting to believe that the ethics of healthcare are immutable, that we are healers, right? The cure sometimes, relieve often, comfort always. The idea that the ethics of healthcare are timeless and immutable, that they are natural to our work, these are comforting thoughts. We like to believe that the values underpinning our work are stable and they are enduring since the time of Hippocrates. But as you all know, these core values were profoundly shaken in the 1930s and 40s when medical professionals took leading roles in the National Socialist regime in Germany. Physicians, nurses, dentists, pharmacists, administrators, researchers, all not only participated, they weren't just complicit, they were not just collaborators. Many of the most terrible crimes of the Nazi era were in fact led by health professionals. Following the war, a very few were prosecuted at the medical trial at Nuremberg, which you see pictured here, but the vast majority were never held to account. And yet their actions profoundly influence every aspect of the ethics of healthcare today. And I often ask students to try and think of a modern ethical dilemma that is not colored by this history, whether it's ethics of genetics or racism and health equity, or issues at the beginning and end of life, euthanasia, right? The cost control issues, ethics of wartime, disaster triage during the pandemic. All of these issues are viewed today through the lens of the medical crimes of the Holocaust, even when we don't really realize it. So rather than trying to tell you how this history affects ethical issues today, I'm going to mainly just tell the story, because you will see the connections, you'll see the echoes. And then I'll end with a few reflections on some of the core challenges that face health professionals in every age, then, now, and into the future, because these are the challenges that this history can illuminate. It does not make the answers to these challenges easy. It makes them, in fact, more complex. This slide is intentionally blank, and it is because before I start telling this story, I have to say something directly to you. As I said, I give this talk a few times a year. It is by far the most challenging talk to get through. And I give a lot of challenging talks, actually. I like to say, if it's not controversial, it's not an ethical issue. If we all agree, it's not an ethical issue anymore. It's just a pragmatic issue. So everything I talk about is a little controversial, but this one is different, and it's different in two ways, a personal way and a professional way. From a personal standpoint, I'm sure many of you give talks, and you know that when you give a lecture, there's a possibility someone in the audience will know the material better than you do, right? That happens a lot, to me at least. But this is different because there are people, and I'm sure there are probably people listening right now, who don't just know this history, they own this history in a way that I never will, because I'm not Jewish, I'm not German either. I have no direct familial connection to this history. And yet, if there is one thing I've learned from my work with the museum, it's that obligations of remembrance in this history remain to us all. This is our shared history. It's not just Jewish history. Of course, it is a part of Jewish history, very important, but we all, I think, must bear the burden of this legacy if we have any hope of learning from it. And that raises the second way that this is a difficult talk. Professionally, it is really hard to take contemporary lessons from this history. If I say anything that helps people understand how the Nazis came to do what they did, first, it will look like I am rationalizing, like I'm giving excuses. But worse, if I make a direct comparison between something the Nazis did and some contemporary ethical issue, someone's going to say I'm playing the Nazi card, which will close people's minds rather than opening them. And honestly, there is truth in that accusation, right? The reality is, the famous thing about the Nazis is that they had some influence on research ethics. Well, we still have ethical abuses in research today, but I don't care what ethical abuse you can think of in research in the recent past. There is nothing that will be the same or comparable to intentionally infecting a young child with typhus and then watching as she dies and then killing her healthy twin so that you can compare their organs, right? There's no research abuse today that is that. It is not comparable. And yet, somehow, we have to figure out how to learn from this history. So I'm going to just start by asking you to try to keep your minds open to learning from our professionals' roles in the Nazi regime, and to recognize that because it becomes so heinous, This history is very prone to oversimplifications, heroes and villains, right? Making caricatures out of what were, in fact, complex human beings, because it is exactly those oversimplifications that divert us from learning lessons from this history, and ironically can actually subvert our vigilance. So the question in the title of this talk is, how did healers become killers? And I want to warn you as we get started here that when we start to seek an answer to this question, we will start to have a very disturbing thought. Again, I just want to give you a forewarning of this. We will never know what might have happened if health professionals had not taken the leading roles they did in the Nazi regime. But it is plausible to think that without our professional involvement, the Holocaust itself might never have happened. Obviously, Hitler did not need doctors to become anti-Semitic, of course. So I know this might sound like a kind of outlandish claim, but I am not the first to make it. This is a quote from Dr. Andrew Ivy in 1946 during the Nuremberg trial. We're going to come back to him in a few moments, but the point is the idea that Hitler couldn't have carried out his plans without the health sciences community behind him is not as outlandish as one might hope. And that's partly because, as Diana started out by telling us, this story does not start with Mengele. It doesn't either start with Hitler. It certainly doesn't start with the Nuremberg medical trial. So if you really want to understand this story, you have to start a long way before this. In fact, you have to start probably in Plato's Republic, or maybe even sooner. This is Plato's description of how you develop a strong and healthy community, which is by discouraging reproduction of those deemed inferior. And in fact, he talks about taking anyone born defective and disposing them. He wrote about the preservation of the purity of a breed of human beings, essentially describing what would in later generations come to be called eugenics, which in its easiest to understand notion is the idea of selective breeding, right? The idea is if you can breed a faster dog or a bigger ox, you can breed a better human being. And if you do that enough, you can breed a better society. These ideals were most famously laid out by Francis Galton after his cousin Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. But Galton's thinking coincides with the rediscovery of Mendelian genetics, which of course today we recognize is a highly simplified understanding of genetics. But it happens at the same time that you're seeing what becomes sort of social Darwinism, because it also merges with an emerging understanding of cells and of bacteria, right? This is the germ theory of disease is emerging at this time, of the idea of chromosomes and the science of epidemiology and of statistics. All of these things come together in a perfect storm around social Darwinism during what became known as the progressive era in medicine and public health, which sparks this tremendous interest in eugenics, which is often thought of as having these two branches: positive eugenics, where you define who is valuable, whom you want to reproduce, you support them to be healthy and encourage them to have babies. But of course, the other side of this eugenics coin is negative eugenics, those whom you don't want to have additional babies. You're going to marginalize them, discourage them from reproducing, preventing races from intermarrying. These are all parts of eugenic ideology. Eugenic ideology was not a Nazi invention. In fact, Germans were not even in the main lead of the field. Many of the leaders of eugenics were English and American. So Karl Pearson, for example, the namesake, if you'll recall, of the Pearson chi-square test, he also invented the idea of a p-value. Much more, he's really a polymath, incredibly bright guy, an English mathematician who believed in effect that genetics was destiny. And he even argued that it was no good trying to lift people up if they were disadvantaged, because after all, the next generation would just be disadvantaged again. This pair of books, The grammar of science was incredibly influential. Albert Einstein assigned it as the first book to be read by the Olympia Academy when he founded it in 1902. But Pearson basically is arguing that stronger races should conquer weaker ones. And by the way, I just want to point out the idea of the so-called Aryan race as a superior one is well established in 1901 when Hitler is 12 years old. The first International Eugenics Conference takes place in London in 1912, and it does include a couple of famous future Nazis. But if you recognize any names on this list, they probably aren't German. They're probably people like William Osler or Charles Davenport or Alexander Graham Bell. And the minutes of this first meeting are just remarkable. So Alfred Punnett, whom you might recognize from your high school biology as Punnett squares, Punnett thought if only we could get all the feeble-minded people not to have children, within a few generations, there would be no more feeble-minded people. Similar conferences are held in the United States at this time. They're called race betterment conferences often. Harry Laughlin is of particular note here because he would go on to write a model law in the US promoting forcible sterilization of people whom the society deemed should not have additional babies. And this was a very prevalent set of beliefs. It was not a fringe set of beliefs. This is a little booklet from the American Medical Association in 1913, where you could invite people from the AMA or from your local medical society to come out and give a talk. And most of these talks were about race hygiene, eugenics, public health, things like that. So I'll just show you the page that has the Colorado people on it. And you can see, you could ask a Dr. Corwin to come and tell you, and I only picked this because I'm from Colorado. You could pick any state. They all had these. So Dr. Corwin would come and speak on how eugenics was going to save society from feeble and degenerate stock. The US was, of course, a leader worldwide in defining races as though these categories have scientific meaning. And then, importantly, using the idea of a racial group in public policy, right? This is fundamentally driven by eugenic thinking. So this is the quintessential example of this is the so-called one-drop rule, defining who is Black. And most states in the US prior to the war had anti-miscegenation statutes, which, and I should put miscegenation in scare quotes as well, but these are the idea of mixing of the races was illegal in most American states long before the Nazis had these kinds of laws. And in fact, when the Nazis came to power, they explicitly studied American race laws and decided that the American one-drop rule for determining who was Black was far too extreme for the Nazis. Germans would not accept that as the definition of who was Jewish. So when the 1935 Nuremberg laws were passed that defined who was Jewish and that prevented Jewish people from intermarrying with Aryan people, it required that you have 3 Jewish grandparents in order to be qualified as being Jewish. And a really important American eugenics law that had a much more important and direct influence on Nazis and Nazi medical and public health policies were US laws that promoted forcible sterilization. These were in place in most US states by the 1930s. I will point out Colorado is not listed as having a law, but that does not mean we do not see forcible sterilizations carried out here extra legally. We have examples of those. And these laws, by the way, did not entirely disappear right after the war. They did continue on and often targeted more marginalized women of color after the war. And North Carolina's law, for example, was on the books till 2003. West Virginia's was on the books until 2013. My home state of Oregon, where I grew up, carried out its last forcible sterilization in 1981, which is the year before I graduated from high school. These laws had made their way through the courts starting in the early 1900s with an Indiana law that was passed and then repealed and then refined and then re-implemented. So Americans did a lot to knock the kinks out and get these laws to a place where they could be sustained by the courts. this very famous or infamous Supreme Court case ends with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying that forcibly sterilizing Carrie Buck because she had become pregnant outside of wedlock, which they assumed meant she was feeble-minded. And her mother was already in an institutional setting, and they deemed that her child also was going to be feeble-minded. So that's the 3 generations, he says, of imbeciles, and that's enough. We should sterilize her so she doesn't have any more babies. As it turns out, she was not an imbecile, nor was her child. They both had probably average intelligence. They got, B's and C's in school. And she had probably been raped by the nephew of the family that she was living with. But this law was, very influential in the Nazi arena, as I'll show you in a moment. But B, it is entirely built on this eugenic public health principle, right? And I put up I highlighted the sentence before the really famous sentence here to show the public health view that is being brought to this law. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. Ignoring, by the way, that compulsory vaccination at this time meant, a $5 fine if you chose not to be vaccinated. So, this was a wild overreach, if you will, of public health law and public health thinking. But it was adopted wholesale and then expanded upon by the Germans when the Nazis come to power in 1933. So one of the first laws passed is this law for the prevention of congenitally ill progeny. It is based on the model law of Henry Laughlin. It looks almost word for word like the California law, with the same list of conditions that warrant forcible sterilization. The Germans recognize that they are not alone. This is a poster from that era in Germany, where they've got pictures of all the other countries around the world that are also establishing forcible sterilization programs or already have them in place. And there are Americans who think that the Nazis are doing the great thing, that they are really implementing this in a very scientific, rigorous way. The way this works in Nazi Germany is that, and it uses many of the same sort of due process provisions in the American laws. Once someone is deemed to be someone who ought to be forcibly sterilized, which usually is because their doctor or their nurse denounces them, but sometimes it would be a family member who would denounce someone. If someone was denounced, that would go to a so-called hereditary health court. There were over 250 of these established throughout Germany. They operated in parallel with the regular German judicial system. They were populated by 2 doctors and 1 jurist. So the doctors had the decision-making authority, but the jurist would break ties. And if the decision was for sterilization, the person had 4 weeks to appeal. Otherwise, the sterilization had to take place, and it would take place even if force was required. I want to say, by the way, these were not Jewish people being sterilized by and large. They were ethnically German, but they were people who were thought to pose a threat to the health of the German stock. The next step in this path is perhaps obvious to you, but the question is, if you are trying to prevent people from having children with disabilities, what happens when a child with a severe disability is born anyways? And the whole point here is that these are children that they deem to be not of value. In fact, they will cost the state money to keep these children alive into adulthood. And therefore, it is good for the state to eliminate these children. And this story that Karl Brandt tells at the Nuremberg trial must be taken with a grain of salt. He lied a lot. Karl Brandt was Hitler's personal physician. He became the chief defendant at the Nuremberg doctor's trial. And he said the first victim, if you will, of this program, which became a formal program, was this child which was born, and the parents actually contacted the Fuhrer asking if they could have permission to put the child out of its misery. He was sent to look at the child, and he said it was true that this child should be killed, but that the doctors would be wrong to make this a decision of the parents, and instead it should be a decision for the state to be making and for the doctors to make. Um, the first mass murder program of the Nazis before the outbreak of war is the so-called child euthanasia program. I'm putting euthanasia in square quotes here because this is not euthanasia that we would talk about today. These are not children or parents primarily who are seeking a good death. This was a cynical, secret, illegal program of mass murder. By August of 1939, just before Germany invades Poland, all physicians, nurses, and midwives are required to report infants and children under the age of 3 who show signs of severe mental or physical disability. The parents of these children are sent a letter saying that they are being asked to send their children to a so-called special treatment center. When the children arrive, they would typically be starved to death or overdosed or killed with an injection of phenol to the heart. But that's not what the parents were told. Parents were told the child was doing well. Then they would be told the child had taken a turn for the worse, had developed pneumonia, for example, and then that the child has died. So this was a camouflaged secret program that was clearly illegal under German law. The program gradually expands from infants and toddlers to juveniles up to 17 years of age. And the conservative estimates are that around 5,000 children with disabilities were murdered by their nurses and doctors at around 35 specially designated children's killing wards around Germany. This program is the predecessor to a program that many of you probably heard of called the T4 program. Because again, the next step seems obvious. If you are killing babies and juveniles and adolescents with disabilities, what about institutionalized adults with disabilities? So by 1940, an adult killing operation was developed, which was codenamed essentially Operation T4 after the street address of the central office in Berlin on Tiergartenstrasse. The T4 program used very similar practices that had been developed and refined for the child euthanasia program. Questionnaires went out to public officials in institutions around the country, including though also private hospitals, mental institutions, nursing homes. These forms looked like they were just gathering data, like about which residents were capable of working. And in fact, there were doctors who purposely exaggerated their patient's condition, thinking it might keep them from going to a work camp. Instead, it marked them for death because these forms would be reviewed at the central office by 3 specially appointed physicians, many of them of significant reputation. And those who were selected for this so-called euthanasia program would then be sent to one of the killing centers, which were established around Germany. There were 6 of these in Germany and Austria. On arrival, the patients would be led into specially designed gas chambers that were disguised as showers. They would be gassed to death, their dental gold would be removed, and their bodies would be cremated in specially designed crematory ovens. And of course, if that process sounds familiar to you, it should, because the technologies that were later used in mass killing centers like Auschwitz and the Reinhardt camps, some of the crematory technologies, and especially the camouflage techniques that could get someone to walk right into the gas chamber. These were developed and perfected in the T4 program. This program also was illegal. It was secret. Official records were always falsified to indicate that the victims had died of a natural cause, but it quickly became an open secret. In the towns, ashes would come down and they would have hair in the ashes. The people of the town came to recognize what was going on. There was an article written about this program in the US press at the time. And there were some religious leaders in Germany who started to speak out against the mass murder of the disabled. And now we're in the war years. So Hitler is a dictator, he's running a terror state, but he does care about public opinion. So in August of 1941, he personally gives orders to halt the T4 program. But the program doesn't entirely go away. After a pause, it ends up sort of diffused across Germany. It's still more or less choreographed from Berlin at the T4 central office, but local authorities now get to determine the pace of the killing. And instead of gas chambers, they go back to the methods that had been used with the child program, like overdoses and lethal injections and starvation, because those are more covert. So killings are now taking place not just at these 6 killing centers, but at hospitals all over Germany, where doctors and nurses would have in the same ward patients that they were trying to heal, but in the same unit, they could have patients that they had marked for death. By the end of the war, about 200,000 people in institutional settings had been murdered in the T4 program. But something important happens during this euthanasia pause. There are about 100 people who are out of work, who had worked in the T4 program, who were reliable. They were running an illegal killing program. They were inured to the killing process, and they had medical and technical expertise in mass killing. So some of these T4 operatives had already been sent to concentration and labor camps earlier in 1941 to set up a camp-based T4 program called Action 14F13. This was a program to murder inmates who were no longer able to work. And there were others like Johann Neiman, who's in these pictures here. He worked first in the T4 program, but then was transferred during the pause to help build and run a new set of camps that would be oriented entirely around killing. So these are the extermination camps, the mass factories of death, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Another person from the T4 program, Dr. Imfried Eberl, would move from the T4 program to become the first commandant at Treblinka. And if you don't remember Treblinka, Treblinka is where the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto were taken for extermination. Over 900,000 Jews were murdered at Treblinka. So the forcible sterilization program, then the killing program targeting disabled children, and then targeting adults. These programs are directly connected to the mass factories of killing of the Holocaust. They are connected by ideology, they're connected by theories of race and eugenics, but they're also connected by direct transfer of technology and medical personnel. All are grounded in this racist ideology with important policy ideas that had been borrowed from the US and other countries. All of them are framed essentially as public health programs using the aim of science to create, and the tools of science to create a so-called master race. And this is where I'm going to kind of take a step back here, because as I show you these kinds of images, I think you must wonder, what were the German health sciences like? What was the community like before the war? And given what it became, you might think that German medicine before the Dark Age, before the Third Reich, was in the Dark Ages. But a great irony of the Nuremberg doctors' trial is that at the time in 1946, the prosecuting attorneys actually went looking for national or international standards. They were looking for standards for the conduct of human subjects research because they had seen these heinous experiments in the camps. And they found 2 national documents that governed human subjects research. Both of them were German. In the 1890s, a Prussian physician named Neisser, you might recognize his name as the namesake of Neisseria gonorrhea. Neisser had intentionally infected orphans and prostitutes with syphilis to test out treatments. The public learned of this and were outraged, and the Prussian Minister of Health drew up ethical guidelines for research for the region. And in 1931, the German Minister of the Interior issued even more detailed guidance for researchers across the Weimar Republic. These Reich guidelines were quite detailed. They differentiated between therapeutic experimentation and non-therapeutic trials, for example. They included something like what we would call an IRB today. They required the unambiguous consent from human subjects research, or the subjects of human subjects research. You had to have written documentation of the consent of the subject, and so on. Medically, scientifically, pre-Nazi Germany was probably, if anything, more advanced than any other country in the world. Following the Flexner report in the United States, it was the German model of clinical medical education that had become the worldwide standard. I'll just give you one example of their sort of dominance. In the decade before the war, Germans and Austrians won 6 of the 10 Nobel Prizes issued. 6. The 1936 prize was actually split between a German and a UK scientist, but German medicine at the time was extremely cutting edge, extremely inventive. I have here a picture of the Siemens electron microscope. Germans invented the electron microscope, and this one was used to identify asbestos particles in lung cancers. Germany was also inventive and cutting edge in epidemiology. This is one of the first large-scale surveillance projects looking at the incidence of cancers between smokers on the one side and non-smokers on the other, showing this massive difference in sex-related cancers because women were much less likely to be smokers. It was Germans in this era who coined the term passive smoking because they recognized it as a health risk. They promoted mass screenings for cancer and other diseases. This is from 1936, instructing women in breast self-examination. This is decades before similar public awareness programs in the US. They also urged women to avoid alcohol and tobacco during pregnancy. They barred smoking in many public spaces, including in party offices and waiting rooms. Excuse me. So the pre-Nazi German medical profession is not backward. They're not backward scientifically in public health, not even in ethics. If anything, what set the profession up for its fall might have been its tremendous successes, its pride, its hubris. German physicians become convinced that they can use medical science and public health methods to create a master race. And the idea is, if you want a fit population, you should do 2 things. You should work to improve the health of the existing population with programs like the ones I just described, and you should eliminate from the population people who are deemed unfit. And if you want to find who's unfit, you turn to doctors to do that task, right? So German physicians develop these elaborate genetic racial maps of disease, which are to both promote healthy pairings and to discourage undesirable marriages. And today we recognize eugenics as ideology rather than science, but at the time it was promulgated, it was believed as a science. But I wanted this image, I think, is really important though in this regard, because this is from a high school biology textbook, and I want you to note it has very little to do with biology. Instead, it's promoting the ideology of eugenic cleansing through an appeal to concerns over national resources. Right, it's looking at ill people as useless eaters, costly to the state. That is a very important frame for the Nazis politically. But I also want to say it's an important frame for the physicians, because it brings physicians to conceive of the German body as the German state as a body, literally a body politic that could become ill as a result of an impure genetic pool. And this idea of a body politic with its racist and eugenic underpinnings is the step that eventually will lead to the final solution. This is an image from way before the war, 1935, that really illustrates this step. It says, Adolf Hitler, doctor of the German people. So under this ideology, Jews come to be described as a cancer or a bacillus, an infection that has to be eradicated from the German body. The Nazis actually called their set of racist political beliefs applied biology. Dr. Ernst Rudin, a Nazi physician leader, said, German doctors should be responsible for, and I'm quoting here, preservation of the healthy hereditary elements and eradication of the pathologic elements in society. And when the Nazi doctor Fritz Klein was asked after the war, have you no respect as a doctor for human life? He actually said, out of respect for human life, I would remove a purulent appendix. The Jews are the purulent appendix in the body of Europe. This quote from Hitler at the bottom of the slide is from an early speech that he gave to the National Socialist Physicians League, where he argued, actually, If need be, he said, I could do without lawyers and engineers and builders, but without the cooperation of people in healthcare, he would not be able to accomplish his ends. So I asked at the outset, how did healers become killers? And one answer is they transform into a group in pursuit of national goals rather than protectors of their vulnerable patients. Now, let me be clear, these are perverted and racist national goals, but they're cloaked in science and public health, and medical professionals of all types endorse them with very little dissent. About half of the doctors in Germany voluntarily became Nazis. That's a far higher rate than other professional groups like lawyers or engineers. And it wasn't just physicians, nurses, psychologists, pharmacists, dentists, all actually had higher rates of Nazi membership. For example, 62% of maxillofacial surgeons joined the party. I just saw that in a paper the other day. The defendants at the post-war trials were often largely nurses, like the Hadamar trial, which is one of the T4 trials. And this question, why is this? Why were health professionals more likely to join? And there's a lot of reasons that have been given for this, and I'm sure many of them probably hold some truth. There was obviously this belief in eugenics and the desire to become national heroes by helping Germany to, create a master race and win the war. There was the fact that Germany had been defeated in World War I, and there was real economic devastation that followed, although the country was actually in an upswing at the time of Hitler's semi-election. There was, however, an oversupply of health professionals. So there was actually doctor unemployment at the time. And there were Jewish clinicians and scientists who held some plum jobs. So self-interest undoubtedly played a role in some cases. And then there was the takeover of the independent professional associations by the state. So in October of 1933, again, 5 years before Germany invades Poland, JAMA reports that a German federal chamber of physicians is being formed, which will take the place of all prior independent physician associations, which are going to be disbanded. By 1938, the German medical practice law is amended. It reads as follows: it is the duty of the medical profession as a group to preserve and promote the nation's health, sound heredity, and racial purity. I'm going to go to the next slide here, and I just want to warn, this is a disturbing slide, but I want to use it to make a point that the imagery and the language of medicalized killing is a key part of the extermination camps. And as an example, I want to talk for a moment about the killing pit at Treblinka. This is not a photo from Treblinka. There are no known photos from Treblinka, but it represents a typical execution pit. Treblinka, I mentioned before, is the extermination camp built to kill the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. It was built in a rural area. It had a reception space where cattle cars were unloaded. And this reception space, to trick people, was made to resemble a legitimate train station. It had clocks and timetables as though trains, and people came and went. It had posters for vacations and so on. And it had a door to a so-called infirmary that had a Red Cross banner over the top. In fact, this infirmary was a sinister facade disguising the entrance to the execution pit, where prisoners would be taken to be murdered if they were too weak to march to the gas chambers. And prison records are kept on this, and they show how medicalized this became. The records would say the patient was cured with one pill, meaning, of course, killed with a single shot to the head. From this level of medicalization of killing, it is not hard to see medical personnel administering mass death by gassing, the final solution at other extermination centers. This is perhaps the quintessential image of the role of the physician, and that is ramp duty at Auschwitz. Medical personnel, physicians, dentists, pharmacists, took ramp duty on rotation, during which they would select those who were destined to go directly to the gas chambers and those healthy enough for forced labor or other cruelties. And of course, because the gas was dangerous, physicians had to supervise the administration of Zyklon B in the gas chambers. I should say there is no record of any physician being punished for refusing to perform ramp duty or any other duty at the concentration camps, but very few refused. It's become common, I think, to say that Nazis viewed Jewish people and others as subhuman, as animals. But these next two images are perhaps the most telling examples how this is not actually the case. It was worse, and it was worse because it was based in notions from medicine and public health. You might be surprised to learn one of the first proclamations of the Third Reich was to bar vivisection. This poster says, Heil Göring, vivisection forbidden. It has the lab animals of Germany saluting Hermann Göring, because in 1933, he said there would be an end to the, quote, unbearable torture and suffering in animal experiments, and that he would send to a concentration camp anyone who thought they could treat animals as inanimate property. So given the subsequent treatment of Jewish people and other groups by the Nazis, one might wonder, what are Jews that they could be considered even less worthy of respect than lab animals? And this is the answer. The title says infectious germs, and the symbols represent Jews, communists, and homosexuals. Here, the scientific gaze of the microscope looks down onto the petri dish of society, completing the biological state metaphor. Here, people have become pathogens. So let me end with some reflections on the present day and the obligation of remembrance. Here you see a curator at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum preserving memories, in this case, shoes, in an exhibit that brings the reality of genocide closer to the viewers, most of whom in the US today are like me. They have no direct familial connection to these events. Sarah Bloomfield, the director of the museum, has said, our museum is unique. It is about responsibility. Our responsibility to the past and to the memory of the victims and survivors, our responsibility to our fellow human beings in the present, and perhaps most important, our responsibility to future generations. So I want to close with reflections on our responsibility as medical professionals, whose ethics and whose work were so deeply perverted and traumatized by the Nazi doctors. How are these events relevant to us today? And the classic answer is the Nazis prompted us to address questions of consent in medical research. And there is no doubt the Nuremberg Code was central to the so-called birth of bioethics. But we should also understand it was not until considerably later that we started to take seriously the idea of human subjects giving consent for research. In fact, Andrew Ivy, I mentioned earlier, was sent by the AMA as an ethics expert to the trial. He realized quickly that the AMA had no policy on the ethics of research on human beings. So he rushes back to the AMA in December of 1946 during the trial to urge the AMA Board of Trustees to pass some standards on human subjects research, which they do. This 3-point set of ethical standards for human subjects research is passed and published in JAMA in December during the trial. But they were written not because we feared American doctors might be abusing patients in research. It was because there was a hole in our ethics document, which we thought might be embarrassing in the context of the trial. And as a result, this, hastily drafted AMA research ethics guidelines, and by the way, the Nuremberg Code, were largely ignored. They were written about, but they were not implemented in practice. And that was because there was a sense that they had been written for Nazis, not for Americans. There was a researcher at Harvard Medical School who said the Nuremberg Code was, quote, conceived in reference to Nazi atrocities and was not necessarily pertinent to or adequate for the conduct of medical research in the United States. Another said even more bluntly, the interpretation of these codes was that they were necessary for barbarians, but not for fine, upstanding people. And so we had to wait for public revelations of research abuses in the US, like Willowbrook and Tuskegee. before we created in 1979 ethical rules for the conduct of research that were and are taken seriously today. But in this sense, continuing the syphilis study at Tuskegee was one result of our inability to heed the lessons of the Holocaust, because we thought German doctors were monsters, not human beings. Let me talk about a few of the areas where I think there are lessons to be learned, but I want to warn you, none of these lessons are easy. Let me talk first about the challenge of conflicting loyalties. Hitler knew that it would be easier to get people to do harsh things in a wartime or a crisis environment. There are many examples of doctors, dentists, nurses, and others acting as agents of the state rather than as protectors of their patients, from participating in force feeding and torture to using dental skills and dental x-rays, not to benefit patients, but to put patients who say they are under 18 into adult detention facilities. So these continue to go on today. But the reason I call this a complex challenge is the reality, of course, is that it is too simplistic to just say, we can only care about the one person sitting in front of us and ignore all the effects of our decisions or the, of that patient on the larger community. At minimum, we know there are some patients we could spend all day with and they would benefit from it. But we have other patients waiting. And so we, on a daily basis, have to balance the needs of the one against the needs of the others. And in the more extreme cases, I think we grapple with things like triage, or a reporting of sexually transmitted diseases, or taking away a patient's driving privileges. Right? These are, and I'm, by the way, not even mentioning the fact that all of us have other commitments in our lives, to our families, to our friends, to, right? All of these things have to be balanced in the life of a doctor. And how do we balance the needs of all of the constituencies that we in fact serve as health professionals? That is not a simple answer. It is a complex answer, and an answer for which there is no one right, a question rather, for which there is no one right and permanent answer. Let me give you another one that I think is very complex. We value skepticism in science. We value people who are iconoclastic thinkers, who think outside the box. We worry about a peak of inflated expectations and then learning that something doesn't work, right? This image is from the hype cycle in tech, but this happens in medicine too, right? People build up tremendous hope that, hydroxychloroquine is going to work, or, I think I must have deleted this, but anyways, the idea that, we can latch on to something and stick with it despite emerging evidence is something that we have to grapple with all the time. We have to find a balance of believing our theories versus being skeptical, too skeptical, not recognizing that, the innovative thinker over here might actually be right. So how do we balance these? Professional self-regulation, tremendous challenge for us. There were numerous Nazis who, after the war, went right back into practice. Many of them took leading roles, including in the World Medical Association and in other associations around the world. This was an abject failure of professional self-regulation, and we fail frequently to regulate our profession on our own, leading the state and others to have to step in. On the other hand, the reason we fail is often because we are really trying hard to give people the leeway of professional autonomy, which we think they ought to have. How do you make that balance? And finally, just this lesson about empathy and professional distance. I find this to be fascinating and difficult. We train medical students in some ways to become inured to human suffering. Throughout medical training, we are actually teaching people how to hurt someone and walk away and then do it again. How to watch someone in pain and then go to the next patient and behave as though you are not affected by what you just saw. And we have limited tools for how to ensure that people retain their humanity throughout the course of medical training and don't become the people who can hurt others without, in a sort of formulaic way. And honestly, I think one of the best tools we have is literature, music, poetry, the humanities, and the arts, which can help us to retain our human nature while also becoming good doctors. And a good doctor, let's be honest, can walk from one patient who's in tremendous pain and suffering and then be perfectly pleasant with the next person you see, as though that did not have an impact on you. This is last slide, and I'll just close on this by returning to where I started, which is there are deep obstacles to honest reflection and learning in relation to this history, because reflecting on these events is profoundly painful. It is in many ways easier for us probably to learn from some of the heroic medical professionals, those in the ghettos and the camps, for example, who provide positive role models. And by the way, whom I haven't even talked about this evening. They deserve our attention too. But the story we've heard tonight is the story of the shame in our profession that we must never forget. And that it would be easy to forget if we were to think of Nazi doctors as purely monsters and we have nothing to learn from them. So I would just extend Robert Proctor's quote here, which I will not read to you because you can all read it. But I'll say that if we cannot learn from this history, our ability to protect against these crimes or lesser versions of these crimes is also diminished. So in the end, I think the question we all face as a community is not just how did healers become killers? I think health professionals today, and not just Jewish health professionals, all of us, all around the world, should understand the German medical profession of the 1930s was not alien or otherworldly. They were world leaders in medicine, in science, in public health, even in the teaching of medical ethics. Because this means the question we have to continually grapple with is not how did a few monsters crawl up from the depths into our midst? We have to struggle with how to understand how most health professionals in the most medically advanced nation in the world become murderers together, and not despite their training, but in the name of medicine, science, and public health.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Wynia, for summarizing what is obviously a very difficult time in our history, but one that is imperative for all of us to reflect on and learn from. We do have some questions. So if it's okay with everyone, I'll just jump right in. The first is, why did the eugenics movement in the US not gain traction like it did in pre-World War II?
That is a great question. And of course, I'll give you two answers because this is a question that we get asked a lot. Why didn't the Holocaust happen in the United States? Why did it happen in Germany, which was not a leading figure in the eugenics movement, whereas we were? And I think number one answer is we always continued to debate eugenics. So it was never a complete coherence where everyone agreed. It was very commonly agreed. There were many leading figures, but there were also leading figures who argued against it, who thought that it was not going to pan out, that it was overly simplistic, that there were other reasons why marginalized communities had more crime or more, right? All because this was a blending, of course, of social issues and medical issues. And, there were many people on the other side arguing against eugenics, and we never had closure around this one idea. And I like to talk about that because I think it really shows the value of vigorous professional debate, even when that debate is mean, right? Even when that debate is tough, right? The point is we have to be able to continue to debate each other and to do the research and to figure out, when things are right and when they're wrong, and to, question each other's, understandings, right? This is where that scientific skepticism, I think, really comes into play. And it, to me at least, it helps me to get through some of the really vitriolic political debate that we see around all kinds of things, but including in healthcare. I think we are better off to have vitriolic debate than we are to have everyone on the same page. And it's a tough lesson, but it at least helps me to see some of the ad hominems and the vigorous debate and feel okay about it. That's okay. I would rather have that than to have everyone on the same page. That was answer number one, by the way. Answer number two is brand new to me, which is last summer I gave this talk and someone in the audience asked that question, how come the Holocaust never happened in the United States? And someone from the back of the room said, who's to say it didn't? It just took place. And the idea that, we ended up having a conversation about this, and they're saying, the idea is we traumatized and killed many people over many, many generations. It wasn't just all in 5 years. But there was an implication of the racist policies of the United States and the eugenics policies of the United States, right? The racism and the eugenics of the United States was not costless. It carried a heavy cost, a cost that we continue to see today in worse health outcomes among marginalized communities. So it's true. And again, I go back to, you can't compare the Holocaust to anything else, but I found that incredibly provocative because it is the case, of course, that racism has costs. It does hurt people. It does kill people. We just don't tally it up in the same way. And it didn't happen all in a few years. It happened over a long period of time.
So this may be a great follow-up question because, as you mentioned, the racism in the United States, the AMA, through its recent adoption of critical race theory and changes that it's making to certain language initiatives, is clamoring to drastically diminish individual rights and reduce people to their races again in an effort to correct for the wrongs of our past. How does one correct for the wrongs of the past without punishing people today? And how do we address this with other medical professional organizations that are following the AMA's suit?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Because obviously there are wrongs of the past. They do have continuing implications for people today. There are wrongs happening today too, by the way. So it's not like racism is gone and we, don't see things that are blatantly racist, but we also see a lot of things that are not blatantly racist, but they reflect the structures of our society, right? So the way I kind of think about this is, if you see across all of American society, as we do, systematically worse health outcomes for one group that is defined, by race, you see systematic differences, right? So you consistently see worse health outcomes in whatever domain among this racial group compared to this other racial group. Well, there are a limited number of things that can explain that, right? Either those people are being treated worse, and by and large, we in medicine at least like to believe that we don't treat people differently, that we treat, people the same. Or so that would imply individual level racism, maybe implicit, maybe explicit, but that's one explanation, right? If we as doctors are systematically treating people differently because of their race, that would lead to systematically different health outcomes. Another is that these people over here have different genetic makeup, and that leads them to have worse health outcomes. That is actually racism, right? So that's what you would call scientific racism. If you believe that the genetic makeup of people leads them to have systematically worse health outcomes across multiple conditions, that would be saying they're weaker. They're a weaker race, and this is a stronger race. So that would actually be scientific racism. We by and large don't buy that either. right? I mean, there are, of course, individual diseases that have a race association, but that's not the general reason why you see these systematic differences. So if it's not individuals treating people differently, and it's not genetic differences between these population groups, the only other option is that there are environmental, systemic, structural things that are causing this entire group to be disadvantaged in society. That's what structural racism is, right? It's the idea that there are structures that are in place in society that end up resulting in bad health outcomes, even though none of us are explicitly racist. Even though none of us are trying to treat anyone differently, we may treat everyone exactly the same, but they come to us with different backgrounds that are influenced by things like, whether they were able to get a good job, whether they were able to get on public transportation, whether they live in an area where they're, where houses are cheap, but they're cheap because there's toxic, environmental pollution, right? All of those things are structural. And when they are structural factors that disproportionately affect one race, that's what they call structural racism. So, how do we address that? And to your point, how do we address that without disadvantaging this group, which is doing quite well, thank you, and don't want to see resources, shifted in order to try and take better care of people who've had systematic structural disadvantages over generations often. That, by the way, I don't feel I'm personally responsible for, but they are here. They're ours. We got them. So there's no one answer to your question is the bottom line. And this will continue to be debated. To what extent do we owe something additional to people whose ancestors and ancestors and ancestors were literally systematically discriminated against, which led them to be in the current structure, which continues to impose some cost on them because of their racial background? And I don't have the answer to that. I think no one does. We will continue to struggle with this and debate to what extent do we, spend additional resources and time and energy thinking about the care and well-being of people who are systematically disadvantaged in society today, in order to sort of bring people to a point of equity.
Well, so there's a follow-up, a more specific question, I guess, to that response. And this has to do with, I guess, some ways that people have tried to make up. And, when we talk about equity, it really is, we're forcing outcomes, which in healthcare, that's always a slippery slope when you try to force equal outcomes. So the question here is, in 2020, there was some talk about how to distribute the vaccines. With the information available at the time, it appeared that if the goal is to save as many lives as we can, we should bias vaccine delivery towards the elderly. That was the highest risk group. The 2020 CDC report, phase allocation of COVID-19 vaccines, said much the same thing. However, in that same report, the ethnicity of the elderly actually counted against them receiving the vaccine. So on this medical philosophy, their lives became less morally valuable because of their ethnicity. Is this an example of failing to learn from the history and a lot of the lessons you proposed today? And I will add, in addition to the vaccine distribution, we had the same issue with monoclonal antibody treatments being allocated based on race in New York City. And FAIR is actually involved in addressing that right now through a legal action.
Yeah, again, I'll go back to, I think this is, a really difficult problem. This is not a simple problem where one side is right and the other side is wrong, because the reality, of course, is that there are multiple groups that were at significant disadvantage and continue to be at significant disadvantage throughout the pandemic. The elderly are one. People who live in underserved communities, who don't have, the capacity to stay home from work and work on Zoom, who have to work in frontline jobs, who are, taking public transportation. Those people also faced significantly disproportionate morbidity and mortality from this. So we didn't just give the vaccine to elderly people. We gave it to me because I was working in a hospital at the time in December of 2020. So I got early access to the vaccine, right? And I'm, pretty advantaged, but I was working in an area that was very high risk. So what the CDC and what the National Academies both said was that we should look at several different things that lead people to have higher risk of morbidity and mortality and target the vaccine to those with the very highest risk. And if you are both elderly and live in a minority community in a multi-generational house with, crowding and people who have to come and go to their work in a front-facing job, you maybe are the highest priority. Whereas if you are an elderly person, but you live in a gated community where you can stay home for the next 2 weeks and wait until the vaccine is, until your time is ready, then that's a safer thing to do. And we will save more lives by doing that. The way it actually played out, by the way, was that most places did exactly what, what you initially described. They were never able to figure out how to target the vaccine really to minority communities and the elderly people in minority communities. They just made it available to people based on age. And so in the end, what, that sort of philosophizing about how could you create a system that would get the biggest bang for the buck by getting the vaccine first into the arms of the very highest risk elderly people, that was almost impossible to figure out how to administer. And we needed to start vaccinating people right away. And so we ended up buying efficiency at the cost of equity. And in fact, the first people to get the vaccine were by and large wealthy white people who were also elderly and who could shop around, who could drive all over and find where the vaccine was and get it. And so, as with many things, people with privilege were privileged here as well. And people with disadvantage were further disadvantaged. And so if you look at how the vaccine rolled out, and by the way, monoclonal antibodies, same thing. I mean, I've got great data on this from every state has seen the same thing. Monoclonal antibodies, you are much more likely to be white if you get monoclonal antibodies. And
well, not in New York.
No, that's not true. That's actually not true. Look at the actual data. The people who have received monoclonal antibodies are disproportionately white people. And I'm not saying that's because they're white, but it's because white people also tend to disproportionately have some advantages, including trust in the healthcare system, right? It's not just money advantages. There's a lot of advantages that lead you to be able to access monoclonal antibodies. And so, every state has tracked these data, and again, it's, just one more disparity. There are very systematic differences in who gets access to monoclonal antibodies early on, when they were really, early on means until 2 weeks ago, because we've had shortages of monoclonal antibodies until very recently. Yeah. So the point I'm trying to make, by the way, Diana, is not that the policy was right. The policy in New York, as our policy did too, it tried to preferentially get monoclonal antibodies to the people who were the highest risk, which includes looking at what neighborhood do people live in. But the systems and the structures made it almost impossible to actually implement that policy. And as a result, we ended up, in fact, with ongoing disparities in access to monoclonal antibodies, even though we had a policy that said we ought to be trying to get this to more people from minority communities that are being harder hit.
I think we may only have time for one or two more, but here's a really interesting one. There it is. Sorry. I think people are adding questions, so then the one I wanted to ask, this one. Pseudoscientific medical practices, in other words, quackery and witchcraft, are infamous for their unethical practices. I mean, that was probably the basis for the Flexner Report in the first place. Yet today, hospitals and medical schools have welcomed many of these practices into their midst, even apparently in the University of Colorado Medical and Hospital campus. How can activists hope to effectively oppose this? And I think this also has to do with a lot of, a lot of entities are calling themselves doctors now, whether or not they actually went to medical school, and physicians are being replaced by non-physicians. And so we see a lot of a return to pre-Flexner days. How do we address this?
I think it's a nice question because it also blends this idea of professional self-regulation. And as I mentioned before, I find this to be incredibly complex because we do value people who are cutting edge thinkers. We do value people who are iconoclastic, who are willing to try things and test them. I think quackery, sort of by its definition, means that you are not testing, that you are not doing research, that you already have an ideology and you're focused on it, and you don't need no stinking data, right? That, to me at least, is sort of the definition of a quack belief, is one that you hold and are unwilling to challenge yourself or to look at whether it works or whether it doesn't work. So if you are in an environment where people are doing research on the things that they are trying, personally, I don't see it as quackery at all. If you are testing things out, which may have not that much scientific basis, may be, difficult to test, et cetera. But if you're trying to find out, does this work or not, then you're still doing science. If you are not, if you are convinced that your treatment works and you don't need to collect data, you just need to collect people's checks, that is quackery. And so it can happen in a variety of places. The places that I see the most prominent, and I'll probably end up alienating someone on the call for saying this, but the orthopedic surgeons who are doing injections of stem cells into people's knees, where we have no data on this, and they're not collecting it because they don't want to collect it, because it would probably end up causing them to learn that what they're doing doesn't really work, but they're making mint off of this. So to me, that's quackery. If you're doing something that is unproven and you are not collecting data to try and figure out whether it really works or not, that's a quack. If you're doing research and you're testing something that you don't know if it works yet or not, then you're not doing quackery, you're doing medical science.
And probably this will be our last one, but certainly relevant to today's world. What advice do you give to your trainees to keep an open mind, especially in the age of social media, groupthink, and cancel culture?
Yeah, that is such a good question, because again, it gets back to this issue of maintaining a questioning mindset, which we all need to do, right? We need to keep our minds open. And as my mom used to say, keep an open mind, but don't let your brain fall out. That's the balance, right? So we value people who are questioning, people who are unwilling to accept the status quo. We also, though, want to make sure that people don't reject things that we actually, right? So if you're telling people that vaccines don't work and that they make the virus worse, well, I understand the theory. We have tons of data that says that is wrong. That theory turned out not to be right, right? So I think we have to both be questioning and inquisitive and iconoclastic and all of that, and still be able at some point to say, okay, that question's been settled, let's move to another question now.
Here's a quick one, since we have a couple more minutes. With respect to literature on human suffering, if you could recommend one specific book, what would it be?
Oh gosh. I mean, Being Mortal is amazing. I'm sure many people on this call will have read Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, which is a very easy read. When Breath Becomes Air is an extraordinary book written, by a physician about his own experience of mortality. Those are recent ones. I think if you are teaching this, we often use William Carlos Williams. There's a fantastic short story that he wrote called The Use of Force, which I think many people will resonate with. And it's a great book for a reflection on the patient-doctor relationship and the emotional impact that it has to be a doctor sometimes. I'll stop there. There are so many. And by the way, I'm not the person who's the humanities expert in our faculty. There's other people who do this stuff a lot more than I do.
So we only have 3 minutes, and I certainly want to respect everyone's time, but this last question that came in, I think is an important one. Perhaps we can end on. FAIR has received reports from our medical community, medical students, residents, and attendings who are scared to speak out. They have seen patients being discriminated against because they're white. Medical trainees are being told to discriminate in order to reach equity. So what do we tell medical students where they're faced in this situation and can't speak up?
So I'll broaden it a little bit, because I think it would be weird to say white people are the people who mainly face discrimination in the United States. That's just empirically, that's just not true. There are plenty of stories, but it's just not the case that in the medical system, white people are discriminated against. We have, by and large, better health outcomes on every metric, if you're looking across the board. Not to say there are not individuals, right? But so what were you going to say?
So what do we tell medical students when they are in a position where they have
So that's why I said I would broaden this out. If you see someone being discriminated against on the basis of their race, whatever race, I think we have to have, practice sessions on how to speak up in those circumstances. And that's the difficult thing for me in these, is that when you are in that circumstance, you know the right thing to do. So it's not actually an ethical issue to start with. The question is, do you know how to do the right thing? And that requires, a careful triage, if you will, of how you bring the thing up, right? So the reality for medical students, if they're seeing an attending physician who is behaving badly, it's going to be hard. So what they really need to do is debrief amongst themselves, find people who are like-minded, talk to the attending individually, not in the front of a big group, right? These are all skills in how to broach difficult issues in a tactful way that is more likely to get a good response than, broaching them in a ham-fisted way that is liable to make everyone entrenched and dig in their heels. So, these are conflict management skills. And I think we have not always taught those well in medical training. We've taught people about ethics, and we've taught people how to decide what is the right thing to do in this difficult ethical situation. We have not always done a good job of teaching people how to actually do that. And as a consequence, we have moral distress, kind of rampant, because moral distress arises when you know the right thing to do, but you don't know how to do it, or you feel like you can't do it. And I think that's the situation you're describing, is one of moral distress, where you know the right thing to do. It's not really, the ethics is not a question here. The question is, how do you do that? And for that, you actually need to turn to things like business schools and conflict resolution trainings. And so that's actually what we're teaching students now, is we're teaching conflict resolution, how to speak up in a chain of command. What are some of the skills to bring things up if you hear something that you think, is wrong, without causing the attending to give you a bad grade.
Well, on that note, I can't thank you enough for the wonderful discussion, the educational experience we all were privileged to have with you today. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone. And if we didn't answer your questions, please send us an email, and maybe if you have time, we'll try and get those back to you guys. Thank you.